Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Stefanos Geroulanos. Stefanos is director of the Remarque Institute and professor of history at New York University. He's got his bachelor's from Princeton, his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and much of his research focuses on histories of concepts that weave together the understanding of the human, of time, and of the body. He's written many books, including the most recent book, the very fantastic The Invention of Prehistory, Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins. It's a fabulous book. I greatly enjoy it and highly recommend folks getting out and picking that up. We start the conversation by talking about why studying a history of history is important and why it's not final. It's a critical piece there. We talk about the emphasis on the nature of man. The book starts in the 1750s and how we used to think about other humans as savages, and really focusing on the natural aspects of a man. We talk about Rousseau and Hobbes' ideas and how they still persist. Human nature and equality, which was a fabulous bit of the conversation. It's the one that really pushed me, and I really loved our engagement on this. And the impact of Darwin, of course. We also talk about the impact of Marx, Neanderthals, the thin veneer, the instincts, Freud's contributions, the Nazis, and how we continue to understand history now and in the future, along with many other topics. Stefanos is a wonderful person. He was quite kind, very engaging, really good thinker, really sharp in a lot of ways. And I really enjoyed his book and him giving me all of his time and energy. We almost went 2 hours, and we had such a good conversation. It was a lot of fun, and really pushing and pulling at different pieces here. So it was really fantastic to talk with him. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. Also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends, contribute. All of that is very helpful. And if you like this episode, there's bound to be other episodes that you like as well. Plenty to choose from, so take a look at those as well. Big catalog there. And now I bring you Stefanos Geroulanos. I am here with Stefanos Geroulanos. Steph, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Me too, Xavier. Thank you so much for this. This is a real pleasure to get to talk about the book with you.
Oh, no, pleasure's all mine. As we were saying before we started, I've seen your book everywhere. People are talking about it. They're excited about it. I'm excited to be talking with you about the book, and I greatly enjoyed it. So it's a win for everyone. The book is called The Invention of Prehistory, Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins. And it's quite remarkable, I have to say. It's a quite remarkable book. How it's well written. You traverse so many different things, but there's a good through line throughout. And it's interesting having a conversation about, on a book of a history of history is essentially kind of what it is, which is super meta in all the right ways, but it's great. So before we get into it, two things. Why don't you tell listeners just a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, all those good things, and then how you came to write this book in the way in which you did.
Okay, so I teach modern history at NYU, generally modern history of ideas, and sometimes more history of science at NYU, where I'm also the director of the Remarque Institute, which is an institute dedicated to the study of Europe and its relations to the world. I started this book at various points over the last decade. I first started thinking about it in 2013 or 14 when I taught a class that was related to it. It was mostly, here's like 5 thinkers that talk about human history and I can have some fun with them. And then gradually it sort of grew. I was doing research on people relating to its subject. And so I ended up having like patchy ideas about how this would work. And then around 2018 or so, I worked with a friend of mine who now teaches in Lausanne, Maria Stavrinaki, who was writing her book, which is called Transfixed by Prehistory, which is about prehistory in art.
Mm.
And I thought, well, if I generally avoid some of the art historical angles, particularly around the 20th century, this still leaves a huge amount of work that can be done around how we think about ourselves as humans, how we think about our origins, and the way in which we play out our origins in political ideas. And so I gradually started writing about it. In about 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, I started committing to it ever more. There's something that happened also, which is that, once you start looking at this stuff, you start noticing all these tons of publications that come out about it. Most recent version was something like, well, are you a morning person? It might be because of the Neanderthals. And so, until then, I would have always had this feeling of like, well, okay, great. And now I started just thinking, anything gets blamed or celebrated because of these origins. So there was a kind of contemporary sense of what is it that we consume all the time that felt much more interesting to me and kind of exciting. So that was the idea. The book I wrote from 2020 to sometime late last year, and now it's going to be in our hands in just under a month.
Yeah. And it's it's very exciting because my impression when finishing the book, no spoilers, everyone should go pick it up. So no spoilers, but this idea of how we understand history is still evolving, right? Yeah. Like it's not a finality, right? It's not like with your book or maybe other people, contemporary writers, where it's like, okay, we figured it out now. Here's how we should look at history. Partly because of various scientific work that's done with genetics and archaeology and anthropology and et cetera. But also because we're continuing to culturally evolve, let's say, and we're having more wide-ranging, holistic ideas of how we understand history. And in that way, throughout all of the pieces of history we'll talk about, and getting up to the modern era, it reminds us that it's strange, right? How do we maintain a type of epistemic humility about ourselves when thinking about ourselves, which is super hard for most of us to do. We like to be definitive and all these things, but it's this idea of we can't really love our ideas too hard, a kind of thing. And we have to be able to adjust and be flexible. And that was kind of the big takeaway that I got even at the end. And so I think it's a book like yours is really essential because it really shines a light on that and how we still have to keep doing that is in a big way.
I mean, this is very kind of you to say, but that was my real commitment, that people tend to really believe they know what it means to, not people, like I do the same. We all the time, we tend to think we know what it means to be human and what the grand story that comes with it is. And yet that story, everybody over the last 2 centuries has thought that they knew exactly where that story ends and how it ends with them. Mm-hmm. And in every moment, they used it to justify very often quite horrific, quite horrific politics. And so it's at one level to say, yes, these sciences are not finished. And at the same time, while we may know a ton more than we did even 20, 30, 40 years ago, the fact of the matter is that all of these different sciences are pointing in quite different directions. There's no unified picture. On the contrary, it's not like astronomy where, like, fine, you'll get a more complete picture of what a black hole is. Mm-hmm. Here, people have the impression that they really genuinely believe what it means to be human and how our origins determine that. And that's really both very dangerous and actually just entirely inaccurate, in relation to how the very same scientists work on this material.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to. It's a sort of philosophical thing here, which is, what does it mean to be human? Well, we don't really know. We don't know now. We don't know from in the past. We don't know where we're going in the future, and it's a strange thing because we are something and we are living and we know what it is to sort of be human, but not really. And we know enough things, but it's not definitive. It's not, the end. It's not all, and there's a beauty in that, but there's also a kind of, there's a little bit of a terror in that too. And it's a very interesting paradox there.
Right? You called it epistemic humility before, and I totally agree. There is and there should be a deep insecurity about this, about what this means, and
No.
how this relates to the way we relate to each other and to the natural world, and somehow this kind of deep skepticism or no, just a lack of assurance is certainly no disaster, but we just most of the time we just like swim right past it and right to the end of the line as though that was a sort of perfect starting point.
Yeah,
I like the sense that we don't actually know, and we may very well never know. And at the same time, what it is that we do share with others, what we do share as human beings, is something that's also precarious. If we're going to be ethical and serious and careful about it, it's something deeply precarious. Well, I don't know that deeply and precarious work together, but yeah,
yeah, absolutely. I think it is important. I would say that for ourselves and for the other, and yeah, for sure. So you start the book. It's broken up into a few sections, but you start the book. You drop us into the 1750s to 1870s. I guess one of the things I have about this is, why did you start here as opposed to before then or after then? What was, starting a history, I can imagine is difficult, but I'm assuming there was a purpose to that. So you can answer that bit of it. And then one of the very original, or one of the first ideas you kind of cover is this idea of, people in the past were savages, right? Especially reserving this for indigenous peoples in America and in other places. But this idea of primal urges, and we're violent and aggressive and all these things, and we're savages. So why the time frame? And tell us about this concept, which we still hear. We don't use that. I think most people don't use that anymore. But that wasn't a new thing I learned in reading your book. It's like, oh, I've heard that. We used to call them, So yeah, tell us about those two things.
So the time frame, you're absolutely right. This book could have had a much longer time frame and a much messier, trickier, more interesting one, if I'd been able to go back to, let's say, the Romans or others. Even like late Hellenistic and Roman thinkers are very doubtful about the story they've been sold about human antiquity, and they're trying to debate that. I thought that would be too tricky, because then you suddenly have like all these centuries of growing Christianization, in which most people who know how to read and write effectively replicate, a Christian, or in some cases, a Jewish or Muslim origin story. And that origin story is more or less the same. Man is made, capital M, is made in God's image and resemblance. And so that scenario is, all told, more or less dominant well into the 18th and 19th century. It is all the way to the present. It's very much alive as a possible answer. But as of the early 18th century, you get people who start trying to say, like, look, the priests are telling us this. This is really not a very effective way of thinking. And not only do they tell us this, but they force the way that we understand science to operate within the confines of these religious expectations. And so we know that the Earth, by the 1760s, 1770s, people knew that the Earth cannot possibly be, 6,000 years old. Those debates have already raged for over a century. And some scientists, natural scientists, have been trying to come up with alternatives to the biblical, not even the biblical account of creation, but the explanation of the biblical account of creation as referring literally to 6,000 years. So that's one scenario that's really important. And I don't really cover the early debates around that, because I think it's not my high priority. But then there are two more. One scenario has to do with indigenous peoples. And indigenous people around the world created a real conundrum, particularly for Christian thinkers who thought, they knew whoever belonged within sacred history. Because suddenly here were all of these other people who did not belong within sacred history because they had not been described. And so at first you have various thinkers who try to kind of categorize them at various points as offshoots from various points within sacred history, and then and after a point they sort of decide that this is just not really quite functional. What they prefer is a system about what they will refer to as natural man, which basically means that Europeans are civilized and everybody else kind of isn't. Or, sorry, this is unfair because in the 18th century, it's not quite that simple. They do think of other great civilizations and partly in inverted commas. For example, China or India, they do think of civilizations that have peaked in the past. And they do think of themselves, however, as the front line of history. And so they start imagining that everybody else who doesn't seem to have gone through a grand civilization has simply not advanced to this point, simply natural man. And there are ways in which we would think of this as a straight up racist approach, but there are ways in which we should think of it also as an attempt by modern European thinkers to say, like, look, we live in these societies that are full of property, inequality, superstition, totally unfair governance, and just are mired in this series of disasters, wars, competitions, and so on. How about instead we wonder what human beings would be as absolutely natural beings? And who do you point to when you have that? Originally, you'd point to Adam and Eve just after they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden. But now you can actually be like, well, those people that we've heard about and in rare occasions may have met one or two, those people are not simply, savage cannibals, but they may be perfect representations of what humanity would be in its original state. And so that's one version where they now have to figure out where human prehistory begins and what it looks like. So this was a long story to say there are multiple answers. One is they can't really think about the history of the earth anymore. They don't really love sacred history. And they have to figure out what they think about natural man, quote unquote, in this. This points to your second question about savages. Yeah. So at one level, Europeans in the Americas from the beginning believed that they were confronting uneducated, unchristianized savages who were, in the beginning, they thought it was a possible free-for-all. But from the moment that they could be Christianized, that missionaries could go, it suddenly became obvious that you had to make a decision whether these are inhuman or human. What is it? How do you parse this? And so the language of a savage or of a primitive, the savage emerges really much more in the 17th, 18th century. Primitive is in the 19th century. And primitive is a perfect description of this because it refers to somebody whom ostensibly you can see, or if you can't see them, you can imagine them just around the corner. But it refers back to early humanity. That's the function of the word itself. It's primal. So those translations of people far away as people long ago, and people long ago as people far away, came to take over. The word savage, of course, carries all sorts of other connotations. Like, if I'm carrying out violence toward the savage, my violence is perfectly legit. The savage's violence is savage violence. You can't expect anything better from them, and so on. So that became a kind of pliable language of nature, which could be good or bad, of savagery, and then of the barbarian that's linked to it. So it was a little like we can be more curious and more excited about these others, but they're also really a threat, and they're a threat in a way that we are not a threat to anybody. So I think this is really the moment when prehistory kind of breaks off from the longer Christian history to which it was attached. And there, the ancients get reinvoked. Lucretius begins to be discussed again, Tacitus for Germany, and so on. So suddenly you start having ideas of what does it mean for people to be living in a state of nature, but having to be engaged and speaking to us in some way. Us to them, to Europeans back then. Yeah. Sorry, that was long.
No, it's great. The question I have here is, okay, so we can look on this with, eyes of maybe let's say 250, 300 years later, and we can say, well, look at these people are terrible. They're racist, they're bigoted, they're awful, all these things. And that may be true. I guess for the sake of argument here, at the time, knowing, if people think about the world in the 1750s and 1760s, there's a lot we didn't know, and there's a lot of things that were unknown for us in many ways. Is the charitable view of this of, well, we're definitely having a kind of outgroup of sorts, right? Where it's a kind of saying like, well, yes, these people are different. We're seeing difference. Is there a space where this isn't a racist, bigoted thing? It's a categorical thing. I don't know these people are different. I don't know how to put them there. I'm going to categorize them this way. It's clunky. It doesn't work, but maybe the primitive thing's a little bit better than the savage thing. Or is that too charitable? Is it like, no, these people did look down on these people and they thought they were less than and they were terrible? Like, what can we say about the kind of motivations behind that kind of categorization?
So at one level, I think you're quite right. It's easy for us to look back. It's easy for us to look back and have this image of the past as somehow failed and awful compared to our grandeur by comparison to it. I don't think that this is exactly how they thought. Now, was it possible for many people did many people know better? And the answer to that is that yes, many people knew better. It's not, as with slavery, the people did know that, or many of them who believed in certain visions of equality, let's say, knew perfectly well that this was that it was immoral. The same thing with indigenous people. There were many, particularly missionary philanthropists in the 18th century, and then especially in the 19th, who were quite horrified about it. Most people, however, we do need to remember, lived in one city where they were born and they died, or if they traveled from one city to another. Mm-hmm. And this was just sort of fantastically elsewhere. And so to refer to them plainly as bigoted is too tricky, and I think too reductive in this story. Also, it's also important to remember that we will similarly be remembered as cruel, horrific, and utterly destructive for how we've handled the environment, to say the very obvious version of things. Mm-hmm. That if there are any humans left 3 centuries from now, they will and probably should look down on us in much the same way as we do now. Mm. I also would say that, for many of them, these were things that were negotiable. They were trying to figure things out, just as we are trying to figure things out, how they relate to other peoples. And so, to some degree, even if deeply imperfect, they were trying elaborately to negotiate what their relationships were. Now, after Rousseau, who in the 1750s and 1760s establishes a series of ways of thinking about the state of nature in which he celebrates it openly. Now, of course, you can say he celebrates it because he sees it as a certain kind of, world of Spartan hardship and a world in which, adornments of modernity have not destroyed the authenticity of human beings or the purity of human beings. It seems to me that, after him, you suddenly do have a way in which you really do have to negotiate what your relationship with early humanity was. And some people will be blatantly and consciously not simply uninterested, but hierarchizing, celebrating themselves at the expense of native people, and other people will be, much more careful and unsure, or they will say there are multiple things that we can think here, multiple options, and we have to negotiate somehow what it is that we can do.
Yeah, on that bit, real quick, I wanted to ask, so obviously people will know, have read, Hobbes' Leviathan. People know the social contract, right, with Rousseau. Is that right? Yeah.
when the
And
second
these are
book
still
was.
ideas that still persist in the ethos of society, right? We still make
Yeah.
reference to these things, social conduct. Theoretically, this still, or conceptually or philosophically, there's still things that pass down, which is fine. I mean, I think some of the ideas are, brilliant in some ways, but there was this notion of that they both had in different ways. There's some crossover there about this idea of the nature of man. Like, what does it mean of how we view ourselves or view other people, and then how that's transposed onto how we create systems or how we do things, or like you're saying, a kind of hierarchy. How much of that, you just briefly, I mean, obviously they're big thinkers and big topics, but just this idea of nature of man, that idea, how we still have ripple effects of some of those ideas they had about the nature of man. We've updated in a lot of ways, but talk about their central ideas about the nature of man, and then that kind of ripple effect that we still kind of interact with a bit.
I mean, it's amazing to me. First off, I should say that it's amazing to me that we still believe in an idea of human nature.
Okay.
It is a profoundly outdated system in which we just sort of flatten out all sorts of differences into simply speaking of a kind of shared nature. Now, I'm not implying that you and I don't share, an essential humanity, but that idea that there is something natural and that what we share is that nature is an idea that ultimately leads us into kind of biologistic explanations of human beings and genetic or neurological explanations, not ones about what it means to share this planet with one another. So with Rousseau and Hobbes,
sorry,
yeah.
let me push back on that, or try to elaborate on that a little bit. I guess I should say, not really push back. I don't entirely disagree with that. I guess many people use the idea, and maybe you'll explain this, but this idea of like human nature as a way of trying to find our equality with other people. Like, you can be from a different country and a different class and different language and culture and blah, blah, blah. But it's our humanity. It's our human nature that connects us. And that's where we are equal as humans. So what do you mean by this idea of not having a human nature? Because I don't disagree necessarily. I'm curious for how you spell that out, though, right? Because then we can get all the way to Nietzsche and we can say, yeah, maybe there isn't really any of this stuff, right? So yeah, how do you see this?
I would say just two things. The first one is that when somebody is pressed to define what human nature is, then that person very quickly ends up in all sorts of pretzel positions, or at least pretzel-y intellectual positions. If you determine one element of human nature, you're almost bound to end up ejecting some people from humanity. So then we cover over that and we say, like, well, it's not simply this. Let's find 3 or 4 definitions that we can generally agree about. And then that becomes a problem. So if you refer to our bodily shape, this is a very tricky situation when we begin to speak of disability. If we refer to certain types of our minds, a mind or consciousness is similarly a dated idea that's very difficult to square with all sorts of questions about, again, you could say intellectual disability or neurodivergence, or you could just very simply say, it begins to produce hierarchies again. So in a way, you could say that there is something about our difference and distance from other species or beings or the rest of the natural world that really matters. There, we end up with an interesting or potentially more interesting idea of humanity. But it's very tricky to determine that is necessarily a kind of, that should be called human nature. That would also say, so a definition premised on our difference from one another as foundational for our equality as human beings. I think that ends up being much more essential, that gives us a sense of plenitude, that gives us a sense of possibility. I would say that these definitions have, how to put this? It seems to me that we ought to be able to determine our equality without having to make some sort of step backward into determining what it is about us as humans that makes us equal.
Why?
Does it make sense that it's like we shouldn't have to explain we're equal because we share, this kind of a brain, this kind of a cranium, this kind of relationship to the world? That is a very, very tricky setup, which leads to these almost eugenic ideas quite quickly that people have had, not only in the 1930s, but more recently as well. That's so the historical dimension of trying to determine what it is what I'm trying to avoid. I don't really think that I certainly don't think that we, let me put it in the positive. I certainly think that we share something that we would refer to as humanity. But I would suggest that it has to be something about both our, equality and difference as human beings, our dynamism compared to the rest of the natural world. And I would resist any effort to define that or to put it on two particular legs, let's say. I would find that the moment that we do that, we end up both with tricky politics and we end up being, exclusive as we go.
So is the premise here is that the things that do connect us are our differences and our dynamicism. So would that mean that we don't have equality as humans?
I mean, I think that we should and ought to have absolute formal legal equality, and that we should conceive of each other as equals. This is not a point that I treat as negotiable. I just don't think that this equality should be founded on some particular idea that we say, well, we should be equal because we're all human because of this. I think the moment that you get to the because of this, somebody's been left out of the picture into this story. I would also proceed to say that, we've now had 2.5 centuries where equality is really an utterly key element of Western societies, or is supposed to be an utterly key element of Western societies. And yet to this day, we're really good at pronouncing ourselves equal, while at the same time, very happily forgetting about, who is equal and under what circumstances. We certainly don't treat, all deaths on television, all deaths reported on television as quite equal. The joke used to be that on the BBC in the 80s and 90s, 1 dead English person amounted to 3 dead Irish or 5 dead Europeans. And, if there were like 5,000 dead in some corner of the world, then they noticed. But at the same time, if you ask somebody at the BBC, they would tell you we're absolutely committed to equality. I think we're failing in the same ways, even to this day, to understand that equality, difference, dynamism, possibility are elements that are so difficult to ground on some particular element, and they have to be ethical foundations themselves. We shouldn't have to say, are you human? Let me just ascertain, do you, Xavier, and I, do we share ABC? Okay, we do. So yeah, we're equal. That is the part about human nature that I find trickier, not the concept of equality or concepts of sharing or co-belonging on this planet. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I got where you're at now. And I think that's a way more thoughtful concept of equality that most people are not thinking through, which I think they should. I think that leads to a more robust way of connecting with people, as opposed to this flattened idea of we're human, so we're equal. And that, you're right, that does get into some pretty inadvertently sometimes, and sometimes intentionally,
of course,
treacherous waters.
I don't want to be implying that people mean badly, or that they're always living in some sort of bad false consciousness or bad faith. But the truth of the matter is that any police station you ask will tell you we are committed to the equality of everybody, and we know very well that that's ultimately not right. Reality. Right. And they are, because partly the concept is sometimes emptied out, but also partly because there are ways in which we found these things, and we need to be able to have we need to be able to have social relations that are not reduced to them. That would be my
it's a nice way of putting it.
Reduced to some detail that we then say, that's the reason for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very nicely said.
Shall I go back to Rousseau and Hobbes, or do you
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to
go ahead. Yeah, just real quick. Yeah, tie that up real quick. Yeah.
I mean, I would say that the one side is that, yes, Rousseau and Hobbes are both foundational. Hobbes with a sense of a violent state of nature and the need for, however, top-down violent commonwealth for him, what we would refer to as a state.
Mm-hmm.
And Rousseau really for this demand that, how do we understand our relationship? How do we transform our society so that we're not everywhere in chains, as he puts it in the beginning of the social contract? Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. So now what is really interesting to me is that both of these ideas get invoked over and over and over. Now, to this day, you could have two basic ways of describing human aggression and what became in the 70s and 80s and 90s a debate about warfare in early human societies. So toward the end of the book, I tried to describe how basically Hobbesian and Rousseauian positions just ended up being resurrected and debated over and over. One position would say that, we are now civilized and we're very, very much advanced from a space of primitive war. And that scenario had its anthropologist supporters, and it had certain sociologists and psychologists as supporters, and it's gone all the way into speaking of a kind of Steven Pinker style, better angels of our nature. We were violent, but now everything's just, utterly wonderful. And then the alternative was a scenario that was established against this kind of anthropological or sociological thinking, against the psychological thinking too, which started with Marshall Sahlins in the mid to later 60s, and then the French anthropologist Pierre Clastres. Sahlins argued that that indigenous people are not poor. They don't live within capitalism, but that doesn't mean that they're poor. They simply don't need to accumulate more than they have. And Clastres argued that basically these same people fight against the imposition of a state, or they fight against the imposition of a certain kind of hierarchy. And now these arguments, the more Rousseauian line, has played its way all the way to well-known books like, James Scott's Against the Grain, which suggests that it really was that early humanity was in a kind of almost Rousseauian scenario, not exactly a noble savage scenario, but a far less violent setup. And it's the imposition of the first cities and the first states that created real hierarchy and real inequality and violence. That's one. And then the other, of course, is the David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, in which, again, we have this image of an early humanity as fundamentally anarchic. Sometimes they settle, sometimes they leave. And Wengrow and Graeber tell us that the noble savage, according to Rousseau, is completely wrong. But then they proceed to give this impression that, now we live in these like state-dominated, completely over-organized societies in which something about our essential freedom is fundamentally gone. And they say this as intellectuals of the left, not as intellectuals on the right. But in a way, this kind of anarchic prehistory leads right back to this scenario, particularly when confronted with ideas like Jared Diamond's or Steven Pinker's, where it's like an ascent from hell into, modern civilization. So that essential division kind of astoundingly existed in debates in Rousseau's time, and it exists today. Doesn't speak too well about, our capacity to imagine the world differently.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting. You see this kind of rift where people will, in some ways, they're viewing humanity in either, a cynical view, or they're in kind of a Pollyannish view, or it's a very interesting way in which, history or certain elements will fall into place and how people will represent that. You mentioned this really interesting piece. So you talk about in the book in the early first part, about this idea of nature we've been talking about. We're talking about the Greeks and children and Germanic peoples and all this stuff, idea of deep time. But there's this one thing that you mentioned that was interesting. The way you talked about it, of history being divided into three, right? This three-part kind of thing. So there's savage, barbarian, and the civilized triad of Napoleon, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, and I think there's some subdivisions there as well. Theological, metaphysical, positive stages. All these, it's very interesting. I never saw it that way. Why? What's with the triptych, the thrice over kinds of ways of looking at dividing history in this way, this Trinitarian kind of way of doing this? What's up with that? It's just wonderful that you noticed it. I never noticed it that way. And what are you, I guess, trying to say about those different triads for understanding prehistory at this time?
Right. So, historians have had a lot of trouble deciding what exactly is the beginning of theories of progress. And the classic usual references have to do with like 4-stage or 2-stage or 10-stage and so on scenarios that are, the 4-stage scenarios are really, they're not necessarily historical, but they're quite dominant in the 1760s, 1770s. And they are trying to say, like, look, there's a basic transformation. As in Adam Smith, you just move from agricultural age through an age that involves a measure of commerce to a much more complicated world. By the 18 teens, I think on the one hand, people are no longer, by the time that the French Revolution, let's say, is decidedly over, by the time that Napoleon loses in Waterloo, it's very difficult to decide what progress would be. For 20 years, 25 years, the French could say, like, we are progress. Like, we're a new society. We are the future. And so on the one hand, it's evident that, with industrialization, for example, progress is a reality. People think about it and they talk about it, but they don't exactly have models. And I tend to think that partly by a kind of intellectual accident, partly because they're not happy with these like 10-stage theories of history in which you can't remember who's in what stage and what the idea is, or like who has enough time to remember 10 stages. They come up with a scenario that's relatively straightforward. And that scenario basically says that you have something that's much more a kind of natural state. That involves people who live in a Stone Age, so that's easy and easy to remember. They can be called savage, and they can be thought to believe in all sorts of bizarre theological ideas, or kind of everything is divine. Now, of course, this is a complete fake. It's not real for anybody out there in the world, but for them, it's quite important that suddenly they can say, like, oh, look, we, by contrast, exist in, are civilized, live in an Iron Age, in a new Iron Age, like an industrial age, and we are positive or scientific. We believe in a certain scientific reality, which of course isn't true for most Western societies, which are quite religious. But for educated, let's say for scientists, I don't want to say for educated, I want to say for scientists, this is a great self-celebration. And for governments like the French government, who want to claim, like, look, we are the forefront in the 1850s, we're the forefront of modernity. It's like, great, we are positive and believe in science and don't have random religious, superstitious ideas. So what happens is that between 1815 or so and 1850, you have these transpositions. It starts with a kind of easy scenario devised by a Danish museum curator who tries to say, like, okay, so how exactly do I divide between all the stuff that we have in the museum? And he says, like, well, some of them are stone, some are bronze, some are iron. And so this division is a kind of taxonomic setup for how do you organize a room in a museum. But it translates very quickly because people can say, like, oh, look, the Stone Age refers to people who still don't use iron, or still don't use very elaborate, don't weld even in bronze. So that's one. And then they start translating it into theological setups. Now, in a way, this is kind of helpful. It does suggest that the other people around the world that you encounter, you ostensibly can divide them into multiple categories, or you can speak of them as, living in a complicated space. But unfortunately, for the most part, it does create, it's this kind of scenario where people say, I'm not racist, but these people are savage. And so it becomes this setup in which they can be like, look, I don't want to have anything to do with racial theory. So that stuff is just for bad biologists.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at technology. And with technology, you can just notice that these people live in simple societies who are, they're violent in a way where they have these kinds of violence that are really savage, and they use stones, or they don't at any rate know how to transform iron the way that we do. And so at one level, that's what we were talking about just a minute ago.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who genuinely believe that the real racists are the biologists, for example, or the others who just say, I'm superior to that.
Mm-hmm.
They say, well, no, if we just give them some tech, then we'll, help them improve on their relationship to the world. And then everybody can be a scientist.
Mm.
So that's the kind of, it's the double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a kind of promise there. And on the other hand, these same people take comfort in that promise, as opposed to wondering, is that actually a real improvement? Or is it a terrible setup? So in a way, they manage to think, and the other thing that happens is that, so again, this is a geopolitical idea. It speaks of a kind of civilizing mission, or the burden of the civilizer, white man's burden scenario, by saying, look, this is who we are and this is who they are. And here's how we can help the savage become a barbarian and then eventually become like us, civilized. So that's one scenario that you see, but it also becomes a way of talking about human antiquity. And in some respects, it's totally essential to human antiquity, because one thing that persists all the way into the 20th century, into the late 20th century, is that, actually, it's kind of hard to find bones. Bones decay with time. So it's very difficult to understand early humanity. So in any way, because you're lucky if you just get a couple of bones in a lifetime, or a couple of skulls in a lifetime of field research. So, but stones are actually kind of easy. Stones don't decay, and it's fairly obvious if a stone has been struck or prepared or devised by humans, as opposed to, broken off other stones into a tool. So the discovery of tools in the 1830s, 1840s is authenticated in the 1860s. And the same system that is used in order to celebrate Europeans and to speak of their, crushing burden of improving everybody else's lives, and thereby ruining most of them, also becomes a way for studying a certain kind of prehistoric, what we would call prehistoric society. So tools become a way for trying to say, look, actually, there were humans here in an earlier geological era, or there were hominids here in an earlier geological era. This is something evolution cannot demonstrate at the time. You don't have, the dating tests that you can now do, the radioactive dating tests that you can do as of the 1950s. So in a way, tools embedded deep in the ground are tools where if you can date the layer, you can also date that humans were there. So then they learned that humans were not there at the same time as dinosaurs, but there were hominids much later, and these hominids can be understood as developing in particular ways, or as having these kinds of complex cultures. So there's a way in which then this becomes, and now I'm about to stop. There's a way in which this idea of complexity of tools becomes a way of speaking about complex tools today, among other peoples. And it becomes a way for some to argue that native peoples are by no means savage or barbarian or anything else. They have a complexity that we don't know. They use tools in ways we could never understand. And this argument is also very present from the 1870s, 80s onward, even if it's formalized just much later. Sorry that it took so long.
No. I love it. I love it. It's
long
great.
Series of loops.
No, it's great. No, it's a very analogous to my train of thought too. I see the whole thing. It's like, oh, okay, how do I explain all of it? I think it's good because as you're talking, I was thinking about this, and I'm trying to find the rhythm of this, right? And the rhythm of this is people are going from, I guess, a kind of metaphysical, supernatural, a deity, an intelligent designer, a whatever religious way of understanding things, which is basically we don't know, so the big guy upstairs figured it out. And then we move to throughout all of these things of well, maybe there's something about us, like in our flesh and blood kind of thing, and that will reoccur in different ways. But the nature of it, right, kind of this natural kind of thing, the primitive thing, and then we get to what you're saying here, this kind of like quasi or sort of scientific / observational of like, well, what about the tools that were here? Maybe that can tell us something. So it's becoming a little bit more scientific, a little bit more tangible of how we think about ourselves, which are kind of representative of the time. Just briefly, because I want to get to the next section, but I mean, obviously Darwin, we'll come to Freud in a bit, but Darwin was huge. Because I mean, the fact of evolution, how he found it. Obviously he was a person of his time. Wallace was maybe a little bit better, a little bit more inclusive in some ways. But how much of Darwin was really instrumental for understanding history? But he also had some blind spots, didn't get everything. His ideas about women, which were probably fair to the time of sorts. I mean, they're not right, but I mean, it was a product of time. But okay, and there's a big blind spot there. There's a blind spot probably also on people groups as well. Maybe some racist idea. Okay, but generally, in terms of like a big system, did he get it right? There's a lot of things that have been validated from genetics research and stuff, but how much as we look to scientific observation, scientific kinds of strategy, he really did put a lot on the map. But what can we say? Yes, he did a lot, obviously, but he missed things too, and he didn't get it all there. So just briefly, what would you say Darwin's kind of big contribution is and the important things he missed, maybe too?
Right. So evolutionary theory as developed by Darwin is explosively important in this story. It takes a while. First, it's very successful, albeit massively debated in the short run, and it takes a while for it to become the dominant approach. But in fact, all the way to the present time, it is a very, very real foundation. Mm-hmm. The terms that he used, and we don't speak of characters anymore, as biological or genetic elements, but the bases that he used become really and remain really, really key, and they remain really key in the post-World War II moment with the so-called modern synthesis, where we have the mixture of genetics and evolution. Now, one thing I do in the book is I try not to rely too much on individual thinkers, but to try to rely a lot more on conversation, sometimes talking about these little elements of their thinking, things that they say kind of in passing. Now, Darwin was absolutely on the right side of history, let's say, regarding slavery, which he found utterly abhorrent. At the same time, he was both a child of his time and quite active in advocating for a kind of biological and social evolution from the people as he saw as the most miserable of native people to modern Britain. So, there was no doubt in his circle and for him too that modern Britain is the pinnacle of human society, that their modern Britain is the pinnacle as it has been of human society, that they are correct as scientists in understanding what it is that makes modern Britain and themselves as the pinnacle of modern society, and in looking back to try to understand their differences, not as differences in kind, not as differences in race. That's important, but as differences in evolutionary progress from the earliest humanities. So when he encounters native people when he's on the Beagle, he's at times quite horrified. And he really has this thought of like, really, this person, I know this person is human like me, but could it really be? Is it really the case? And so he has to think about this. And later he learns about, the destruction of native cultures. And again, he's very much on that like, oh, this is a sad, unfortunate fact of disease that these people are disappearing. It's not, there's no agent. Nobody's killing them. It's just in a kind of strange passive. By the time that you get to the Descent of Man, so The Origin of Species is 1859, and it says very little about human evolution in it. It's more indicative. Though he does use language where he's clearly thinking this is going to be important for people to understand about human evolution. When he gets to the Descent of Man in 1871, he's far more confident. He is trying to follow and to work with and really to outdo many of his contemporaries in arguing that human evolution has everything to do with his evolutionary system. Now, he does have a lot of allies, some closer, some more distant, and many of them have articulated aspects of this. So the idea that we parse Darwin out on his own is both unfair to them and sort of unfair to him. But by this point, he is much more comfortable speaking in largely eugenic terms. Eugenic terms that he's learned in great part from his cousin Francis Galton. But which he also, to be fair, is exactly what we were saying before. This is like the great hope of how do you improve on humanity. It's difficult to imagine this today because, first off, we recognize like the horrible politics of eugenic thinking, but it's also impossible to understand how exciting this was, the idea that you're not simply promising to change society, but to regenerate human nature and to, recreate humans and to make humanity into something fundamentally bigger. This sounds absurd to us in a way that, how should I put it? Like the Elon Musk promise of adding like little chips to everybody's brain and so on. And ultimately, where will we be left with the kind of at any rate, I don't really think I need to go to that, but we're not exactly going to be fundamentally different human beings or natural human beings. We'll end up in different debates. For them, this was something very new and something really important. And so those politically deeply regressive, deeply striking, often shocking ideas are in the Descent of Man, just as they were very much in his time. In a way, it may be it may be possible to say that just as Darwin was right to oppose slavery, the result of saying no, we are not all made of different stocks, of 4 or 5 different racial stocks, led him into saying we're made of one stock. And then this got him caught into the corner of like, okay, so what accounts for these differences? So a lot of the book tries to look at these moments when people, they solve one problem, ending up in all sorts of other problems. And it's why I was saying before, it's kind of unfair for us to, and you as well, it's kind of unfair for us to sit on our perch and look back. It's these are odd solutions that the moment that they're said, where we can sit here and be like, aha, do you see? Steph says that Darwin was wrong and a horrible, progressively eugenic racist in this construction when he was trying to solve an issue. But that's just how thought works. When it's not individual, concepts trap us into particular ways of thinking because we have alternative narratives and we drop one where like that's politically awful and we end up in another where we don't know what it is or we just happily ignore certain political awfulness.
Yeah, I mean, 150, 200 years from now, people are going to look back on us in this time frame and say, what the fuck were you guys doing? What were you thinking? That's insane.
Exactly.
That's terrible.
Exactly.
And
And
we're going to say
but
we didn't know. We didn't know all the
Yeah.
things that came afterwards. Don't judge us on what we don't know. 150, and certainly there are things that people say, well, it's just common sense or that's so nice. And I don't really buy those arguments. I think that there are plenty of things that people do now that they feel is morally correct and morally just and very ethical. And I'm not saying that this is true necessarily for Darwin or anyone else. And certainly there are bad faith actors at every period in history. But there are certain people that legitimately, they're like, I did my best and we didn't know. And yeah, it's terribly horrible 100 years later. But at the time it wasn't. And we didn't know any better.
Yes. And I think that's exactly his version.
Yeah.
That's exactly his version as well. That he's come up with a much more progressive approach, one that doesn't deny the humanity of anyone. In fact, he's very explicit about this. There's a moment in The Descent of Man, a sort of famous moment when he says, between the lowest savage and the highest ape, there's an utter abyss which will never be crossed. And he does see this as a kind of human unity. But that's the kind of world that they end up with. And so then at times, it's the success of his ideas and the failure of his ideas which end up being invoked over and over in the decades to follow.
Yeah. So in the next section of the book, you talk about a lot of big thinkers, and I do appreciate the pool of trying to just focus on a thinker, but there are some that are, Darwin's a big one that was still impacts so many disciplines. Another big one is Marx, and I would be remiss to not mention him here. Interesting in how you treated him in the book was you talk about him and communists like him afterwards, is kind of our Marxist, if you will, that thought about the structure of family and society in particular ways, the utility of marriage, things like that. How did these ideas that Marx and Marxists after him, how did that impact the idea of viewing prehistory with these kinds of lenses of sorts? What was the kind of stamp there?
Right. So there's in a way two sides to this. The first one is that from very early on, and it's worth noting that in the 20th century, this became way more intense. People would accuse socialists and communists of inventing ideas contrary to human nature. And so they relied on a canon that begins really with Marx and Engels to say, no, as a matter of fact, what you call nature is merely capitalism, and you just don't understand that there is a very real natural family, a real relationship to nature. Now, in the early stages of his thinking, Marx is kind of vague about this, and he has some ideas which are kind of nostalgic for pre-modern society. But closer to his death, he is, very excitedly reading some of the key anthropologists of his time, some of whom want to say that, the original or, quote unquote, primitive family was made up of either great violence or just, forms of very strong hierarchy. And others, really, Henry Louis Morgan, argue instead that it isn't a matter of violence, it's a matter of fundamental shifts. For Morgan, the original family was matrilineal, and Morgan tries to construct this by working on the Haudenosaunee or working with the Haudenosaunee. And at other times, he tries to construct this by looking at families or extended families in Greece and Rome. The original version, he says, was matrilineal, and Marx is very excited about this because the way that Morgan organizes this is that he leads to a moment when the original matrilineal society collapses and is replaced by a patriarchy, basically. And the patriarchy emerges when the men in the family will no longer tolerate a matrilineal scenario because they feel that they are in control of technology and they're in control of property, and they ought to have they're the ones who do the physical work, so to speak, and therefore should have the rights to the property itself. So what this means, so Marx writes this all up in a notebook, and then after he dies, almost immediately after he dies, Friedrich Engels, his collaborator, finds the notebook and basically writes up the book. And Engels says, like, look, I'm going to replay Morgan's theory. And he suggests, like, look, there is an outside to capitalism. There existed a way in which women were equal. So they are concerned at this moment with, appealing to women, or with just saying, like, look, this kind of male-dominated society is not the only one that's an option. So they imagine that there is an outside to that, and that's fundamentally matrilineal. And they say, like, look, just as there was an outside, after the end of capitalism, once communism wins, we will also be able to live not simply in a society that's differently organized in terms of money, property, and so on. We're not simply going to overcome that. We're going to overcome fundamental, familial inequality. We're going to be able to undo gender as it exists. And we're going to be able to produce a true equality between men and women. And so for Marx and Engels, there's both the look back, and there are many others speaking of a primitive communism at the time, before even they come to the term. And that primitive communism is a promise for the future. It's a promise, this promise that I was trying to mention before as well, that it's like, we're not simply changing the world, we're making it more natural. We're going back to something that existed that has been lost. And so from there on, you have a whole tradition, which on the one hand leads to Stalin's constitution from 1936-37, and to Stalin's, dogma of communism, that originally there was primitive communism, and now we exist in a communist society, which blah, 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 is equal and so on. But it also is a matter that's very elaborately used by, socialists in the West all through the 20th century to say, well, not all through, but, by the 1960s, this theory doesn't really hold. But they support this in saying, like, look, there isn't anything natural about capitalism. You can't simply invoke those ideas and call us unnatural and just decide that this was the rationale. So that's one long story moving forward of a basic idea over which Marx had, very limited effect, but where Engels kind of constructed a way of looking to the past, to the present, and to the future as an escape. As an escape from the world as it is currently organized.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then, of course, there are ways in which, to add a little bit of this isn't simply a communist idea in the 20th century. Matrilineality and matriarchy become essential. It's like the fantasy of ancient Knossos, ancient Crete. As being a matriarchal society, Kathy Gear has written beautifully in her book, Knossos and the Prophets of Modernism, about how, this invention of a matriarchal Crete was all about imagining a peaceful space in the sense, like right at the time, between the two world wars, which is so inspiring to Picasso, to Hilda Doolittle, to so many other artists. And so there are ways in which this becomes essential, and essential also to feminists who see it as insufficient, but see it as an essential foundation for undoing a kind of capitalist exploitation of women as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting to see the reverberations of what starts with Marx and Engels, and then other people pick it up and kind of look at it differently. It's interesting. So two things here. I'm going to merge two things together as sort of attached. Is you talk about Neanderthals. There was a space for a while where, there's still there was still the Geico commercials and things like that, that you're, right. You're, dumb as a Neanderthal, or, all these things. And, I this is another thing of like, this was like a pre-human of sorts, right? At the time, and now we know a little bit more and much better information, thanks to technology and things like that, good archaeology. But there seems to be, or there is at the very least, kind of racial undertones with this and how people talked about Neanderthals, or maybe overture. maybe it's not undertones, right? Maybe it's explicit, but whichever way you want to say it. And kind of along with that, I mean, a little bit different but similar, is this idea of the thin veneer, which is really interesting, right? I mean, even I still hear that phrase used sometimes about, are we just aggressive and violent under the surface, and we all these things. And so maybe just tackle the Neanderthal thing, but then I'm curious about this idea of instincts as well, with the thin veneer and stuff like that. So yeah, tell us about the Neanderthals a bit.
So as is probably evident, the Neanderthals were one of my favorite chapters to write. They're just so fun to track. And images of the Neanderthal have been really essential since the beginning. Now, we need to remember that today we are in a completely different age. The Neanderthal genome has been mapped, and we have a much clearer idea. So I don't necessarily think it's a clear idea or an unpolitical one. There's a sort of deep political danger in believing that that's the case.
Did you read the book Kindred, I think, by Rebecca Ragsky? I'm sure you've read this. I mean, that was like the big,
yes.
like kind of masterpiece in my mind recently of like, okay, here we are. Here's the most current understanding of Neanderthals, and they're more elaborate, the more, I'm sure you've read this, of course, yeah?
Yes, and then there's also, the Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize, has his own book on Neanderthals and so on. So in the last 30 years, so let's maybe start from there. In the last 30 years, we've had this movement of generally Neanderthal specialists who are like, okay, all these ideas that you have about Neanderthals, even the images that go through our minds when we first think about Neanderthals, are completely false. They're based on a century of research that tried to construct the Neanderthals as basically other and use largely colonial ideas to describe them. And now we have a much better and cleaner and much more correct, ultimately, understanding of the complexity of their life, the complexity of their relationships to their environment, and of their relationships to sapiens. Now, let's just sort of quickly rewind back to the 1850s, when the late 1850s, or the moment when the first debates, right parallel to Origin of Species, the first debates take place over the Neanderthal skull cap from the Neander Valley in Germany, and then they rapidly discover other crania that have been found anywhere from Gibraltar to Minsk in Russia. That they've already found, but that now can be categorized as relating to this thing. What is this thing? Is it a different race? Is it a different species? Everybody's driven mad by this question because they can see that there's a substantial difference, but they're spending all this time measuring crania for indigenous people all over the world. So they're like, well, maybe it's just a little bit more different than the others. And as a matter of fact, this question, race versus species, goes all the way through the 20th century. In the 1950s, one of the most remarkable of prehistorians and an anatomist in his case, Wilfred Legros Clark, is like, this is exactly the limit between race and species. We don't know how to categorize. And more recently now, of course, the species difference, we usually speak of different species in terms of they cannot, let's say, procreate together. And now we know that sapiens and Neanderthals did mate. So fascinating that we're stuck with all sorts of conceptual problems with them. Anyway, so at the beginning, it's an issue of race versus species. By the 19-teens, they construct them as a separate species, and the image of the Neanderthal, which has until then been just a kind of generic caveman, a grim caveman, the Neanderthal now moves into being a kind of almost standard, almost like way over the top colonial subject. They're definitely black. They're definitely gorilla-ish. This was the attitude at the time, and they're definitely sort of dumb to the world. In some versions, they're particularly violent. This is a famous drawing by Franciszek Kupka, which got replicated time and time again and was included in modified form in multiple books, most famously Orson. H.G. Wells's Outline of History, which sold millions of copies. And then later, it continues into the 1950s, 1960s with painters like Zdeněk Burian, who again describe effectively a very hairy, dark-skinned, kind of dumb-looking creature. Not entirely dumb. They're hardworking. They're, making stone tools. They do live with clothing and so on, but fundamentally closed off. These images of a being that cannot see into the world or doesn't see the future, doesn't have the complexity that sapiens do. So this is a mirror image. It's how do we understand ourselves and how do we understand others?
Yeah,
that persists. And this is the image that more recently they've tried to overcome. I tried to argue in the book that we need to be careful about this because from being basically a hairy, dark-skinned, inferior being, now more recently you have Neanderthals being described as blonde, white, blue-eyed, and current representations have very much this look. In some cases, they're kind of hot. They're you wouldn't necessarily automatically swipe left as the and they're all being represented in this way. And then by comparison, in come the genocidal sapiens, right? And so that leads straight to white replacement, far right, white replacement, white genocide theories. Even if this is absolutely not the intention of the scientists, one needs to be really careful with what is meant in this. And so that's something to be really to be attentive with. It's not like we're out of the woods or like we have suddenly come into thinking of our relations with Neanderthals at this point.
Just one point on that is when people talk about, I've learned this a lot in talking with historians or even people that have been writing about history, is there's no history, like definitive, this is the story, this are the facts, this happened and this happened. Like that doesn't exist. Like people like to think of it that way. Like, oh yeah, there was this war and this happened and this person won and, things like that. But the more and more you read of history, the more it is perspective, right? And the people that do win a war or they do, the conquerors or whatever, usually write those stories. And it's so incredible to me how when I've looked at kind of alternative history or history from another perspective that's not the prevailing view, people get so incensed about that. You're changing history. You're changing what the story is. That's how it is. You can't tell me that this was this and this and this. And and everything that you've been saying, but for whatever reason, more specifically in this point about Neanderthals, it's like, yeah, we don't know. You can't sit here and say, well, that's how it is, and that's why now you're changing it because of whatever ideology. There's always a bias or an ideology that people put when they're writing things down. Like, of course there is. Like, there's no definitive in a lot of ways. What you're saying here just reminds me of that point.
Yes, and we need both a measure of criticism toward that and a measure of generosity. Critique is a way of saying we recognize that people thought or think differently. Disagreeing doesn't mean that we just say like, oh, that perspective and my perspective are as good as each other. It means that I have to commit to helping improve on somebody else's perspective when I disagree, but not by throwing it out the window and pretending that we know so well. With a lot of this, I think this is quite right. We simply don't know. We simply will never know because we're talking about peoples who lived 50,000 years ago. Do we have a fairly strong sense of many elements of these societies? Yes, but in fact, Neanderthal society, for example, it appears that Neanderthal, just sheer population numbers were relatively small. We don't know necessarily how this translates. We do know that they were far, far, far more intelligent than we have liked to believe. But it's a kind of series of bizarre and difficult spaces in which these are really strong, educated guesses. And the moment that we go from educated guesses to truth, then is the moment when we've lost something.
Yeah.
What you said about people being incensed, I have a very serious example of this, namely that for a short while at NYU, I was directing a small institute funded by NYU and by the French National Center for Social Science Research, which included a Neanderthal expert who was among a group that had, it appears, quite conclusively demonstrated that a particular burial of a Neanderthal was indeed an ancient burial, that it was indeed intentional, and that it had been done with ritual and with care. Now, this was a subject that had been debated for basically a century. And they worked to figure out, in as conclusive a sense as they could, whether this was an intentional burial or not. And the guy was receiving threats because people were incensed. And why were people incensed? I mean, at the end of the day, I wondered a great deal about this with the book. I think that people agree to accepting certain things. Let's say with a religious perspective, you come from a religious standpoint, but you are also willing to say that, yes, modern science has shown us that if God made the world in 6 days, then those 6 days are not 6 days, sun up to sundown, dawn to sundown. We're talking about 6 days in divine terms. Fine. So we're working with a slight metaphorical way. So what do we say? We accept that Homo sapiens is the child of God, and the rest of nature is qualitatively different. Now, in you come, and you want to mess it up for us. You want to begin to force us to think that Neanderthals are like us and that there's all of these other sorts of things. And people get incensed. It's not like they really want to stick with a hard religious perspective that thinks that all of this is an abomination. It's that in order to get to a point where they balance what they believe in religious terms and balance with what they believe in secular or scientific terms, something that we all do, things that we find unacceptable, things we won't discuss. They end up saying, but that's my limit. Human beings are my limit. All the Homo sapien stuff, fine. I'm willing to believe this and that. But here you are, and you're trying to mess up what ritual and religion is to tell me that, Neanderthals believed in God. So it was one of the parts that I found most peculiar. People really get furious. So yeah, that's part of the backstory.
It just, I mean, I've heard these stories before, but I'm always just kind of it just baffles me that very intelligent people still believe stories out of Mesopotamia from thousands of years ago as their limit. And everyone can have their religious beliefs, that's fine. But at a certain point, if you have literally evidence staring at you in the face, hard evidence that you got to give something up here. And yeah, that's more about the power of belief than it is about, certain observable evidence. But so, okay, I think
you're right, though, because just for one quick sentence, that it is observable evidence is so difficult to incorporate a lot of the time.
Sure.
We all have elements of this, and then we hierarchize and we organize and we know certain things and we prioritize certain beliefs over others. So it's, on the one hand, it's a situation in which we do really end up with ridiculous ideas.
Yes.
Or with ridiculous concoctions.
Yes.
I have books, kids' books from the 1980s that purport to show ancient Judea, and they're and here, by the way, were the Neanderthals who went extinct because God willed it. And this isn't random, these aren't entirely random systems. It's attempts to make the world work.
Yes. It's a lot of hermeneutical gymnastics, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. Okay, so real quick, the thin veneer. So the question I want to ask about I want to ask on this is, I was reading the book and I said, I don't know if I agree with him on this. So this idea of instincts, we certainly have instincts, and I think there's a kind of evolved way of thinking about that over the past 200 years, let's say. But how are you tying? You can explain what the thin veneer is, but where do you see the value of our instincts generally? How did people in the end of the 19th century into the 20th century think about this? But just more generally, this idea of just below the surface, we can briefly get to Freud right after this. But how do you think about this thin veneer and instincts?
I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. So the thin veneer idea emerges in a largely colonial context. Out of, in part, what we were discussing earlier, for example, the three-part argument. It's like you have a kind of natural, ostensibly savage being, and on top of that, you have culture. And there are multiple colonial either reports or novels. L. Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines, is like an extraordinary case of this, where he uses this all the time. But many others did so too. I'm forgetting the other author that I would have in Jack London is another example, for whom there's something truly atavistic. There is that kind of figure. And culture is but the thin veneer. Now, originally, this is in a colonial scenario, which sometimes is meant to say, here's what distinguishes us from them. It may be just a little bit because we're all animals underneath, but it's a substantial little bit. Then the psychologists come in, and for the psychologists, Freud especially, this is a way of talking about things that exist beneath our cultural exterior. So Freud uses this to say, something like the thin veneer of civilization is like our ego. It's just a kind of last little layer, but all the real force comes from within. It's the drives, or what was translated into English as instincts. It's our animal selves that are the foundation. What are the drives for Freud? Really, they're toward sex, which is intended as procreation, as a biological need. And then there are ways of protecting oneself, not protecting oneself, or feeding oneself, like the basic things that are biologically necessary. So Freud uses this language, as do many others in his time, whether people wondering about individual psychology or people especially wondering about group psychology. And it's an idea that, these elements about our sociability are really just like the last little tidbit. But the depths really are still our evolutionary animal. And so that's also one way of accepting evolution. By the way, evolutionary theory wasn't accepted because everybody sat down and compared different species, or they bowed down to Darwin. It was through these little aside ideas that it worked through. And by World War I, though, you really do get a really fascinating way in which people start using this politically, aggressively, to say, the German is an animal, and you, as another Brit, have to lose the veneer of civilization that you have, and you have to be a savage. Otherwise, that savage will kill you. And in this kind of face-to-face opposition, you get the real shit. So that's like the short story of it. But you were asking, in a way, about our instinctual selves. And far be it from me to say that, this isn't a reality. It's a way of thinking about, I think instincts are a way of thinking about ourselves, which suggests a measure of depth. More recently, people speak of emotions or affects. I much prefer the Freudian language of drives, which is a language that is much more, I think, much richer and much more complicated. But that's also something that comes with it. It's like, are we really our animal selves, or do we think about it? Are we supposed to think about it in different terms? By the 1960s or 1970s, first you get the story of the killer apes, which is meant to be a translation of this original aggression story. But then you also get psychologists or anthropologists who are like, I'm just going to find the original nugget of aggression. And I'm going to find this original nugget of our deeper self, which is this instinctual, violent savage. And of course, by that point, that's not really, working very, very well, because in part, they're not thinking, the Freudian terms are being left aside. Nobody really wants Freud's totem and taboo and the totemic meal and the primal father. But they really kind of, it's like they want different elements. So, but the people who are trying to do this are like, I'm going to be better than Freud. I'm going to figure out the reality of it from from scratch. And so this language, I think, is very, very present and very real. And we live with it also because after a point, it's also a great language for, for disappointment. Like, how hard is it to say, like, look, we've come so far, right? And yet we're messing up our world all the time. We're treating each other horribly. Under it all, we're all like savage animals, which, by the way, is unfair to the savage animals. The damage that they can do to one another is far more limited than the damage that we do. So that's I think that I'm closer to I think we're closer to one another in this than I suggested in the beginning.
Yeah. No, I like the way you explain it. I mean, I'll just say on this is that, in my view, so I like Freud a lot. I think he was wrong on a handful of things, but I think generally, I think his system was good. I think his system of making sex not as taboo, which I think was important. Yes. He went way overboard on it, but I think that was a good contribution. And I do think you see this in neuroscience now, where they're looking at, even with things like consciousness, but other ways of saying, like, Bayesian priors and how we have certain ways of understanding where do things rise, this very unconscious kind of way. There's a little bit of crossover there, but conceptually and philosophically, I just see Freud as systematizing and making, in a very clinical way, which had never existed, Plato's tripart soul. I mean, that's really how I see it, is he sees all of these things, and the three, the rational, the emotional, the desires, the passions, or whatever, and just giving it new language, unconscious, preconscious, conscious. But he's doing it in a way that's trying to make the human psyche theoretically digestible for clinical use, which had never been done before. And anybody that goes to any type, you could be an MD, a PhD in psychology, social worker, counselor, marriage family, doesn't matter. Everyone's getting some version of that because it's the first. It's not perfect, but the first system that still, as a system generally, is very good. And I tell this to students all the time. It's like, everyone likes cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever the new thing is now, but all of that comes from Freud first. It's tremendous how much it's done. And I think that, yes, one of the great things about Freud is that later Freud, while people didn't agree with his death drive or death instinct as much, I quite like it actually, but is I think it's really good. He had this space of saying, okay, this is a work in progress. I didn't get it right. Okay, let me evolve. Yes. Let me update. Okay, let me try and figure. And I really respect that. I mean, late Freud, you're hearing less about, sex with your mom and, whatever. Maybe he was done with the coke benders or something, but like, it's just, he definitely tried to find the balance, trying to moderate it and try to see it more holistically. And many of the Neo-Freudians were starting to challenge him and come up with things. But even people like Erikson or Jung, who, Erikson's cool, but, wasn't crazy about Jung, but he was engaging with them in good ways of saying, okay, maybe we don't agree, but I'm going to try and understand where this could be pushed. I just think that I agree with what you're saying, that the drives piece is important. And I think structurally, he gave a good system of trying to understand people that was at least organized and somewhat structured, imperfect, but not a bad way of trying to understand humans.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise, and perhaps that Freud is one of the few people who come off well, I think, in the book. Freud and then Juliet Mitchell, the feminist and psychoanalyst in the late on in the book, are among the few heroes in a way in the book. And I think for me, it's the reason for it is partly one of a kind of profound admiration for a system that tries to understand both human plenitude, but also, tries to think with conflict a lot more than others. I don't particularly like systems that begin out of a sort of like, oh, everything is going to be just like, calm as the the degree zero.
Mm-hmm.
With Freud, there's conflict, except in death, and life. It involves this kind of series of tensions, and these endless series of tensions are not things that we can simply escape, but they are things that we have to somehow explain. And just as you were saying, so the primal father and the murder of the primal father theory is like Freud at his wildest, and Freud at some level having the most fun possible.
Yes.
And it is the kind of thing that is, okay, wildest, I'll stick with that.
Yeah.
But then he comes to the politics, and he comes to 1919 in Vienna and 1920 in Vienna. And he's like, why is it that, until now we had like Franz Josef was Big Daddy, but now suddenly every like major leader in the streets has these mobs who act as though they're hypnotized, who love the leader. And he may be thinking of Gabriele D'Annunzio as a sort of proto-fascist in Italy, or he may be thinking of Lenin, and he's trying to figure out how to make this whole procedure work psychically. What is it about power that makes us attracted to it in this like utterly submissive way that's involved in the crowd? And there he brings back the primal father, and it's a totally fascinating construction, but it's also not something. Psychoanalysis outlived the Wilder moments by a lot. And so for me, he's also exemplary. Like, they all do exactly this. They come up with an argument, and then they drive this argument to an absurd extreme. But everybody else constructs it differently. Freud constructs the murder of the primal father in such a way that you reach it, and all that you can do is just be like, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
Like 10 pages ago, you were citing all these anthropologists one after the other, and you were really careful. And now we've just gone wild into like the shadow of the dead primal father rises over the soul, and it's the birth of the Oedipus complex and everything.
Right.
So, like, I think that they all do this.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to say. It's much more present. So yeah, Jung ends up. I'm much more critical of Jung in the book.
Yeah.
But Freud and later Juliet Mitchell. I mean, Juliet Mitchell is really one of the few heroes of the book, like with unmitigated respect and adoration from me for her psychoanalysis and feminism, the way that she tried to negotiate the function of the psyche and the difficulty of claiming that we've overcome anything of the horrible patriarchal past.
Yeah, that's great. So I have you've been so generous with your time. So I have three final questions here. We'll kind of get through them quickly here. So obviously much has been written about this. So I'm curious, just your kind of snapshot view of this is, you can't talk about history of sorts, and as we get to the more 20th century without talking about Nazi Germany, of course, and their view of history was very specific. So they've taken all these ideas: survival of the fittest, flooded hordes, ruins, ancient Germans, obviously Aryans, heritage, all these things. Why? I guess the question I have is obviously this captured, all of Europe, mostly unwillingly, for 10, 12 years, whatever it was. Why do we still care or give attention to how the Nazis thought about history? Obviously it's important to know our history, but why do we care so much about their, again, overly granular, specific, elitist, obviously terribly bigoted view of history? Again, Nazis, Germany at the time. Why do we still care and want to understand this?
So for me, there are really two key reasons. The first one is that in the book, I try to argue that we all hold deeply problematic ideas about, our relation to human origins. I'm not trying to blame somebody today in a kind of obvious way, though with some people who make a point of publishing them, it's kind of hard not to. But we all have ideas, and we think that they are, the reality of things. And so I tried to look at some of the more horrible aspects of the past, of the relatively recent past, by the way. This isn't so long ago. And say, look, we think that our ideas cohere and we think that our ideas are nonviolent. We have to be able to think again. Now, with the Nazis, in a way, they may be the worst of the bunch. They are the worst of the bunch. But they're not the only ones with profoundly problematic ideas. In fact, one aspect of that chapter is that they actually have a system of everything that's come up to this point in the book, systematized in order to treat the Jews as the lowest and in order to celebrate themselves as the real humans. So they have this whole argument that, there are creators, sustainers, and destroyers of culture, which is a tripartite division in which the Aryans are the only creators. And so they kind of create an essentialist view of this scenario. They look back into this linguistic Indo-German theory, which is what really is Indo-European theory at the time, Indo-European linguistics and mythology theory at the time, and they turn it into a way of their own original purity and greatness. They decide on moments like early Christians and Greeks, which they say, is their messianic past and their chance. They look at ancient Germans and they're like, look, they destroyed Rome, and so shall we. But these are elements of these ideas are held by most Europeans who read and write and study at the time. I do want to insist on this. Like these are educated setups. It's things that people teach relatively regularly. And so I think it's important to see how easily this gets twisted. And the second element is that to this day, one, it's so easy to say like, oh, the person I disagree with is a fascist.
Yeah.
And to also look back at fascism or at Nazi culture and to think that this was, mere barbarism.
Yeah.
Now that's one argument, but it's a political argument. And, for the longest time, historians have tried to see in what ways even entirely and even anti-Nazi ideas were picked up, brought into this extraordinarily complex conglomerate that was Nazi ideology. We simplify it like we know it. We can identify it and point to it. But things were not nearly that simple. And so I really wanted I wanted there to be a first, peek in the book where all of these ideas in somewhat modified form are used by the Nazis. And then some of them are used by the Allies, partly against the Japanese or others, again, to speak of superiority or against, non-Northerners, less modern people, let's say. So that's why I cared in this case.
Yeah. I think it's important, and I think the way in which you talk about it, because again, much ink has been spilled on Nazis, and we still currently talk about it. But I think the way in which you describe it is essential. So the other question here is kind of last part of the book, kind of in more modern times now of how we kind of talk about history now. I'll blur two things together here is, now when I read books that are evolutionary, theory or anthropology or whatever, sociology, it's a lot of, we focus on humans are unique because of our, bigger brains, we have better cognition, and we're able to use tools, and we're bipedal, and all of these things are distinct for us and essential for who we are. Now we understand that that's what makes us distinct from other, apes or other animals. And then even more recently, we've spent time thinking about, we've had a long history of patriarchy and the evils and perils of patriarchy and what that looks like, and as a more social, cultural piece of things. How do we understand, or what do you think? You don't have to give a valence on this necessarily, but as it stands more or less today, how do you think people are understanding us as humans and our history? And where do you think we're misguided on this? Where are we misled? Where are we still we got the blind spots. We're not seeing it all. Where do you think this is?
So, right. So let's say, I tend to think that we are in a moment of transition for history on human, for the history of human origins, let's say. We're in a moment of transition because there's no plausible overarching theory that manages every aspect of recent research. Neuroscience going in one direction, archaeological findings are going in multiple directions. This isn't to reduce the work that people are doing. Genetics goes in a different direction. There are all sorts of unclear circumstances where more research will lead us to something different in 10, 20 years from now. It's not that the basics are wrong. That's not what I have in mind. It's that it is a moment in which anybody who comes in and tells us, here's how it is giving an ideological solution. Harari's Sapiens is the most obvious case of this. I think a truly atrocious book, which has convinced Silicon Valley bros that they really know, that they really are, that humanity is the creative imagination, that human nature is this capacity to picture, and that they can rule over the future because they can picture AI and you name it. Great. I mean, that's politics. That's nothing to do with the work that's being done on the side. And I also would say, I think that the problem is a slightly different one. So one scenario is that we get these, you get these moments in the news in which people need to distill it all, and they need to say it all in a New York Times article of like 800 words. You're like, this is just not workable because we know so much and we don't know how to organize it, and we don't know how to hierarchize all this kind of knowledge. It's not surprising, but it is a difficult situation for people who need a soundbite. And then there are all sorts of little biases that, we've had all these narratives coming in, and it's difficult to decide which one is right and how we negotiate them. Okay, so that's one version. The other version, which I want to ask about, is ultimately, why do we need to look at human origins to decide who we are as human beings? I think that, the study of prehistory is wonderful. I can't tell you how often I see an article and I'm like, that's amazing. And then I look back at it and I'm like, wait, what did I just agree to? Because I've been doing this for so long, but the first reaction is, this is the coolest thing I could have seen. So I'm not someone who's like immune to the joys of this. But it does seem to me that we have to be able to ask who we are, not by virtue of this giant story that is a story with an awful past that's been used in all sorts of awful ways, and where we don't actually have the capacity to abbreviate, contain, abridge the story into something we can all agree on. We all have elements of it, and we generally agree on it. Those of us who prefer it over religious explanations, for example. But we don't have enough detail to be able to, we have too much detail and not enough to be able to have a single argument. But more importantly is the second question, why do we need it? And I don't think we need it. I think that the story is, I think that defining humanity has to come through something different, that we have to be able to understand our relation to the environment, our relation to the cosmos, our relation to thought and technology, and our relation to ourselves, not by way of this logic which says this is what nature is, this is what our genetic heritage is, this is who we once were and therefore are, because that's deeply problematic. The patriarchy is a classic example of this. It's, in a way, the reason why I like Juliet Mitchell in this in the book is that she does write like, wait. We've only barely identified the complexity of how the patriarchy works into the psyche. And we're going to pretend that we very quickly overcome it by virtue of a feminist pronouncement that the patriarchy is simply bad, and now we're claiming to have, succeeded in a revolution? Or do we have to think about this and fight against these kinds of preconceived notions for a much longer time? So, to me, the sense that she offers is one in which we stand unsure. We don't know how much these ideas, how deep a hold they have in us. And we have to be able to negotiate that. And we have to be able to negotiate that at the same time as we negotiate the fact that 50 years ago, we weren't cyborgs, and now to a great degree, we are. We live with pills and chemicals and foodstuffs that had never existed until recently, not to mention that we can receive transported from Chile in 24 hours, and so on. I'm using Chile just as an example. Like, from another end of the world, in 24 hours, we have something. That is so far from natural. And this is to say nothing of our computers, our devices, our, metallic hips and so on and so forth. That we need to be able to understand ourselves by way of complexity, technology, and transformation, of dynamism and difference, and the need for having some real equality, rather than by way of being like, well, once upon a time, the humans, the hominins came down from the trees onto the savannah, and so on and so on and so forth. I think that's the way that I would reach to the conclusion of that question, where we are and what we do.
No, I think it's great. I mean, I think that's there's so many things to kind of pick apart, and that the transition period really resonates. Steph, this is so much fun. I greatly enjoyed this conversation so much. The time just flew by talking about these things. There's so many things we didn't get to, so people should definitely buy your book. It's fabulous. And I'm just so happy with what you've done here, and keep writing away, whatever you have working on next. We need good thinkers like yourself. So a big thanks for coming on and talking with me all about it. I really enjoyed it.
Xavier, this was so much fun for me, and I'm so grateful to you for the way that you set up questions and the way that you engaged me all through. I'm sorry that I went out like way too much detail at times.
No, not at all.
But it was just like the huge fun of being able to engage with it, with you, and with the way that you said that you were bringing me in. So thank you.
No,
very, very
thank you.